We'll get started in a couple minutes after everybody gets in here, and probably actually wait a couple more minutes after that because we had a problem with streaming to, normally when we do these, we stream to YouTube and Facebook and Twitter, and that's not working right now. So Soph is going to post this Zoom link on all of those, or a couple of those platforms, so people can join us right here on Zoom. So we'll give them a minute or two to be able to join us, and then we'll get started. You'll notice as you're coming in that it's going to tell you that we're recording this because we're not live on those other platforms. So we will take this recording and then we'll post it on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter later, and probably premiere it so it still seems like a nice live event. So sorry for any of you that were ready to watch it there and to share it. Just a technical error that we can't fix, unfortunately. We still have a couple of people joining us.
Well, I'm there, but I'm not.
And if you could all please make sure that you're muted. Still a couple more people coming in through the waiting room. All right, I'll get started now. If somebody else that is a co-host could just keep an eye on the waiting room and let people in as they come in, and make sure that people are muted, that would be great and easier than me letting them in. Okay, so welcome everybody. For those that missed it, we are normally live on social media right now, and that didn't work tonight. So we're only doing this on Zoom right now. So we'll probably have some people joining us late once they see the posts about that. We will post this later on those platforms. It's being recorded right now. So if you, probably it's not going to capture everybody's pictures if you have your camera on, but if you don't want to be seen and you do have your camera on, go ahead and turn the camera off. And then just make sure that you stay muted while our speaker is talking. And so we're really honored that you've all joined us this evening. We, I was going to tell you that we're streaming across 4 different media platforms, but we're not. Tonight's presentation is called Deadly Exchange, Israel and US Policing. We will be closing the chat tonight. It should be open right now. And if you want to take a minute to put your name into the chat and tell us where you're from, and if you're with one of our co-sponsor organizations, that would be great. As members of the End Domestic Militarism Committee, Women Against Military Madness, we are honored to have all of these important groups co-sponsoring tonight. Those groups in alphabetical order are American Muslims for Palestine, Minnesota, Anti-War Committee, Communities United Against Police Brutality, Jewish Voice for Peace, Twin Cities, Middle East Peace Now, Minnesota Break the Bonds Campaign, Minnesota Peace Action Coalition, Northfielders for Justice in Palestine, Israel, Reclaim the Block, Twin Cities Coalition for Justice for Jamar, Veterans for Peace Chapter 27, and Veterans for Peace Chapter 115. And hopefully I didn't miss anybody because we've been adding co-sponsors the last few days, which is really exciting that there's been so much interest in this. So before we begin, please note again that the chat will be disabled in Zoom when our guest begins his presentation, so as not to distract from what he has to say. But we do invite you to ask questions during the presentation using the Zoom. It'll just be sent to the hosts. So we will be keeping those so we can use them later for a Q&A following the presentation. After the Q&A, we will show a 9-minute video that was produced by Al Jazeera in 2020 that features the Deadly Exchange campaign and our speaker's research on the close ties between the Israeli military and US police. And then we will turn the chat on again so you can thank our speaker and talk amongst yourselves. So I'm going to hand it over to Diane now, who's going to introduce our speaker.
Welcome. Tonight, we are thrilled to introduce our guest speaker and presenter, Eran Efrati. As a former Israeli military officer in the Israel Defense Forces, Eran is now the executive director of researching the American-Israeli Alliance and an investigative researcher into the Israeli military and arms industry. He has worked with the International Criminal Court and participated in both independent and UN investigations into Israeli military operations. His investigative reports have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Guardian, among others. He currently serves as chair of the board for Jewish Voice for Peace, and his research focuses on military and police partnerships between the United States and Israel. Welcome, Eran, and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan. I have to say, unfortunately for my parents, I was not an officer in the Israeli military. I was only a first sergeant for almost 4 years. They would like to see me go on and stay in the military, but I did not. But I nonetheless appreciate the invitation, appreciate all of you that came here tonight. I hope you can hear me okay. I don't see most of you, but I see some nice smiling faces, which I like, and some thumbs up. So thank you for having me, not only to talk about Deadly Exchange, but for having me as part of your series of terrific events. I went through the social media WAMM and was deeply impressed by the videos of your last events. And for this important conversation of the Deadly Exchange, I'm not only excited to be with anyone that comes from anywhere right now and join us on Zoom, but I'm especially excited to be with you who are in Minnesota right now and logging in, which is such an important and inspiring battleground for the movement against state violence and for racial justice. Tonight, I'm here to talk with you about the trainings of US law enforcement with the Israeli security experts in what is known as the Deadly Exchange. The national and fast-growing Deadly Exchange campaign seeks to end these trainings and work towards demilitarization of US police and our cities. Now, I believe that in order to fully understand militarized policing in the US and build and organize abolitionist campaigns, we need to identify police institutional ties to American military industries. The Israeli trainings of US police are crucial for the joint Israeli-American military-industrial complex. This military industrial complex is embedded in US racial projects that go beyond traditional war, such as policing, and operates through this joint US-Israeli police trainings. Now, as many of you, I believe, who have been doing work against militarism for decades already know, Palestine is a site of experimenting and refining tactics of technologies of Israeli warfare that is exported all over the world. The laboratory of an industry that is developing for over 70 years now. I want to expand on that today and offer another critical angle on this alliance, the role Israel plays in US empire, both at home and abroad, and specifically how the American security regime works through Israel to fuel domestic militarization. And so this evening, I want to shortly break down what is the Deadly Exchange, who profits from it, how is the Deadly Exchange tied to military industries and the militarization of police, and why is it so dangerous for equality and justice in Palestine and right here at home for us all. As the end starts saying, as a former combat soldier and first sergeant in the Israeli military, I saw these connections firsthand. And since then, for over a decade now, as an investigative researcher, I've been tracking on the ground in Palestine delegations of US police arriving in Palestine to train in Israeli security practices and tactics. In 2017, Jewish Voice for Peace launched a campaign called End the Deadly Exchange, which aims to end the trainings of US law enforcement by Israel. So all of that said, remembering that racial capitalism and the institution of police itself in the core is the problem, I want us to focus on the militarization of US police as a long-standing crisis in the US and Israel's role in it, okay? So the militarization of US policing dates back to the US colonialism of the Philippines and occupation of Vietnam, where the US military brought surveillance and occupation tactics back to American streets. But with 9/11, we see a serious escalation of this. The war on terror brought with it a new framing of security that required a more expensive and violent government practices against US citizens and residents. And Israel is stepping in this moment to play a significant role worldwide and in the militarization of American civil spaces. So not only police, legal system delegations, politicians alongside police are traveling regularly to Israel. These delegations are part of a larger security framed exchanges between the countries. Now, saying that, it is important to understand what US forces are actually looking for when going to Israel. They do not go to Israel to learn how to be racist or violent, but go because they are racist and violent. In Israel, they find an ally, settler colony with a shared mission, motives, and enemy. US policing was always a racial project, right? But it is refined and developed in Israel through Israeli apartheid. So let's go back to 2002. Just a few months after 9/11, the first delegation of American officials already went on these new versions of trips to Israel, including NYPD, LAPD, together with agents of the CIA and FBI, as well as the core crew that will establish ICE less than a year after, and also a few civil employees. For example, the MTA from New York, the transit system in New York and in New Jersey, they joined that first trip. In the last 19 years since, hundreds and hundreds of American law enforcement, together with local police departments across the country, ICE agents, border police, transit authorities, SWAT teams, and even university campus security have all traveled to Israel to learn tactics and strategies under an anti-terror framing. Until today, more than 40 states and well over 300 police departments from across this country have sent delegations to Israel, with thousands more being trained back in the US by Israeli security experts as the officers from the US police force responsible for the killing of George Floyd, who received training in restraint techniques and anti-terror tactics from Israeli law enforcement officers right at home for you guys in Minnesota. So who is paying for this? The trips are completely sponsored and funded fully for all participants, and they serve as the basis for possible promotions and gaining expertise. These trainings are directed at high-ranking officials set to run a unit or a department and join the decision makers level. Many of these trips are taxpayer funded, while others are privately funded from a range of 501c3 nonprofits like the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, and JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, to private corporations and all the way to federal grants and Israeli government grants. And I can talk more about sponsors, funding, and connections to specific programs like the 1033 program you might have heard about in the discussion if you are interested. So what do they actually do there and with whom? While framed as a counterterrorism seminar, the delegations themselves are focusing on themes like crowd control during protests and riots, deep surveillance, military weapons and technologies, intelligence sharings, and immigration. The delegations will meet Israeli police officers, but also military personnel, Israeli military personnel, of course, intelligence and security experts at the national airport, the Ben Gurion Airport. In some cases, they will meet military prisons COs and even political Palestinian prisoners in military prisons in the West Bank, and sometimes even Palestinian police officers that are collaborating with the Israeli military. Delegates, American delegates will be especially interested in meeting those Palestinian police officers, in understanding how to recruit local players from the community to police themselves. Delegates will witness live demonstration of Israeli control of occupied Palestinian territories, so protests at the West Bank, the command room in the Old City in occupied East Jerusalem, and in some cases, a visit to the Gaza border. We tracked delegations of US law enforcement that traveled to the Gaza border, where in recent months, Israeli tanks were lined up to shoot hundreds of shells into the Gaza Strip, and where Israeli snipers waited in recent years, as I'm sure you remember, for protesters with the March of Return. They will meet officers of the Israeli military on the border, explaining to them what is their definition of protecting a border. And their definition of protecting a border on the Gaza border is snipers shooting dead anyone in sight. These trainings that are happening at the expense, of course, of Palestinians also have dangerous effects that all of us in the US should be concerned about. In a special report we've researched and wrote for over a year, including tracking and observations of US law delegations, and interviews of Israeli soldiers and American law enforcement officers who came back from the exchanges, we detail the three main effects that are coming back to American streets. So effect number one, expanding surveillance. This includes comprehensive visual monitoring in public places and online, and heightening infiltration of social movement and entire communities in the US. One important example here that we are using in the report is the demographics unit. Did you ever heard about the demographics unit? The demographic unit is a NYPD covert unit, also known as the mosque crawlers, that work to surveil and arrest Muslims and Arab New Yorkers after 9/11. Once it was exposed, it was also revealed that the unit was based on an Israeli military unit called Mistalavim. Mistalavim in Hebrew means to look more Arab or to be more Arab. Arab Jews like myself that are joining units of the Israeli military that infiltrates Palestinian villages and communities to suppress any resistance to the occupation disguised as Palestinians from the community. And that NYPD unit was based on Mistalavim for years, working and surveilling Muslims, citizens and residents in New York City. Effect number two, justifying racial profiling and marking Black and brown people as suspect, particularly Arabs and Muslims, and refining the policies, tactics, and technologies that target communities and social movements that seek racial justice. An example that we use in the report here is airport security, specifically Ben Gurion Airport, which is an important site for delegates. It's considered the gold standard for airport security. But as some of you experienced yourself, unfortunately, it's simply based on racial profiling. So from the moment you enter the airport, Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, people of color are all directly profiled by Secret Service agents and security guards. Today, most airports in the United States are using Israeli personnel and technology, and many of Ben Gurion airport policies and tactics have been exported to all major US airports around the country. And effect number three is suppressing public protests through use of force. So treating protesters like us as enemy combatants and controlling media coverage of state violence. There are many examples the delegations are witnessing on those trips, including regularly Friday protests in occupied East Jerusalem and in the West Bank against the settlement and the military occupation of Palestine, of course. But an even more telling one, perhaps, is a visit to the Gaza Strip border. So as I said earlier, some delegates go to the border with Gaza, where snipers gunned down protesters in the March of Return, including with the Tavol automatic rifle. It's an Israeli development that replaced the M16 that we used to use in the military. We used to use the American version M16, and about 15 years ago was transitioning out and was replaced by the Tavol. It's the main weapon in use by the Israeli military today, and the Tavol is currently in the hands of police departments across the US after seeing it in action in Palestine, used by the Israeli military. But perhaps the most crucial puzzle piece to understand the effect of these delegations is that they contribute to the US-Israeli military industrial complex. These delegations help facilitate lucrative contracts and deals between the countries, including under the auspices of the US military aid to Israel. The military aid to Israel that I'm sure that many of you heard about a lot is currently the biggest of its kind in the world. It's a mechanism really that facilitates contracts between US and Israeli weapon companies and between these companies and the US and Israeli governments that generate massive profits, largely subsidized by US taxpayers. So by you, by me, by us. To legitimate these deals, contracts are framed as a security necessity, and police delegations help mediate this process. When delegations arrive to the Israeli showroom of occupied Palestinian territory, any corporate deals that come out of their trainings are understood as advancing US national security, with delegates as new advocates for Israeli tested products. US companies which supply weapons as aid to Israel have also facilitated massive subcontracts for Israeli weapon corporations, which fueled both industries. For decades, 24% of the billions of dollars in US military aid to Israel was given in contracts for its own, for Israel's weapons companies, which was critical to developing the Israeli military industrial complex to what it is today. But with the current US military aid package to Israel is changing the power structure between the two countries. I don't know how much you heard about it already, but give me 5 minutes to explain to you how dangerous what happened a few years ago is affecting our life now. In what seems to be one of the final acts in late 2016, the Obama administration, minutes before their leaving office, signing the latest memorandum of understanding with Israel. So Barack Obama and Benjamin Netanyahu, who both are famous for their hate to each other, giving us the feeling that the liberal government in the US pre-Trump, pre the Trump era, which, I admit that I missed a lot during the 4 years before last October, are doing something that at the time feels almost inconceivable, but in hindsight feels more and more understandable to a lot of us that are working in this field. So I said, as one of the final acts of the Obama administrations, they're signing the new MOU with Israel that came into effect as of 2019. Starting a process that will eventually require that 100% of the unprecedented amount of $38 billion in military aid will be used solely for contracts from American weapon companies with ties to the government. So what that means is that American weapons corporations, through their contracts and tenders under the US military aid, created an entire market based on the occupation of Palestine. They are earning contracts through the alliance with Israel, and at the expense of the Palestinians, they are literally making a killing. What we saw in recent months in Palestine is not something that happened only there, only inside Gaza or East Jerusalem or Lid or Haifa or Akka. Israeli offensives on the Gaza Strip are not only war crimes, they have afterlives in American policing. Throughout the past months, the bombs that were dropped on Gaza, the planes that dropped them, the shells that were fired from the land and the missiles from the sea, as well as the grenades and bullets that injured and killed protesters across Palestine were all made in the US. And the companies who've made them already received new fulfillment orders just in the last few months. Some of these weapons make their way back into American streets. We have traced Israeli technologies that were tried for the first time in Gaza during the 2014 offensive. I was there on the border interviewing soldiers, and we traced since 2014 the technologies from surveillance devices to machine guns that arrived to the hands of US law enforcement. And we already have new research just in this last 3 months that in the latest offensive last May, 3 artificial intelligence technologies were tried for the very first time in Gaza. The Israeli military calls them the alchemist, the prophecy, and the depths of wisdom. They will soon make their way to Israeli showrooms, and from there possibly to law enforcement around the world. This is an historic moment, in many ways centraling Minnesota in the heart of it. When following BLM, we are having unprecedented conversations across the country about police abolition and the harm that policing has caused to so many communities. While in Palestine, we are seeing a unity uprising from Shah Jarrah to Gaza to Lid, an uprising against the Israeli project of militarized policing, one of settler colonialism and ethnic cleansing. In this moment, it is important for us in the Palestine Solidarity Movement to advocate for an end to the exchanges with Israel, which is a small but important part of the bigger call to demilitarize and defund the police here in the US, and to ultimately, hopefully, build together real safety for communities in Palestine and here in the US. When your law enforcement go to Israel, they train with the Israeli military against their enemy, the Palestinians. When they return back home, people of color and social movements are the enemy. They are collaborating together to oppress us. We need to organize together to resist them. And now is the time. This is the moment I have personally have waited for many years. And I know that so many of you that are doing this work for decades have waited for this moment for so long. We, in many ways, can create this change on the shoulders of the work that you have already been done or doing, for many, many years. So I hope you'll join us now to end the deadly exchange from Minnesota to Palestine. And I want to thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. And I think a lot of us know bits and pieces of this information, but hearing from people who have more direct knowledge and direct involvement can kind of help connect some of those dots and ties things together. So it was really great to hear from you. Thank you. We are going to do the Q&A after we watch the video. So just a reminder that You guys can send us questions if you have any questions about what you just heard. I always like to think that when we don't get a lot of questions, it's because the speaker was really, really good and didn't leave too many holes in the information. So we've gotten a handful of questions, which is great, but we definitely have time to answer more. So if you have a question, don't be shy, just put it into the chat to the hosts and we can ask that at the end. I am going to hand it off to Jo now, who is going to, before she introduces the video, she's going to let us know about another upcoming event that we have. Let me make sure that Jo can unmute herself.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We invite you to stay to view the short video after the question and answer period. It's called How Israel Community Control of Police. It will be online on Monday, August 23rd at 7 p.m. The Twin Cities Justice for Jamar will present information about their efforts to establish community control of police in Minneapolis. The first step in this process is to pass an amendment to the city charter that creates a Civilian Police Accountability Commission and outlines its basic organization, duties, and powers. Right now, they are collecting signatures for a petition. This is an opportunity to learn about how the CPAC works and how it will benefit the citizens of Minneapolis.
Right, we're gonna do the video now. I think Jo told us that the video is next, except her sound was going out a little bit there. So I think we missed that part. Thank you, Jo. Now let me get the video for you guys.
To note that the video starts right away. We just want you to be aware of that there's no real introduction. It just starts right away. So, but I think it's very powerful and it's ties in very well with what Eran was speaking about. And he was instrumental in helping produce this video, and much of his work and research is in it as well. Thank you.
U.S. police are training in Israel, and that's something every American should be concerned about. As protests sweep across the U.S., it's becoming increasingly clear that law enforcement has become more militarized, treating the people they're supposed to serve and protect as a hostile foreign population. Part of the reason why is that since the 90s, and especially after 9/11, U.S. law enforcement, including police departments, the FBI, CIA, and immigration officials, have been trained by Israeli agents.
These exchange programs are exacerbating the violence in both places and lifting up the Israeli occupation as a global gold standard for policing.
And communities of color in the U.S. are disproportionately paying the price.
Police, since its origins, have been a racist and brutalizing body. But through time, their efforts of brutalization have taken on a new character. That new character is police exchanges.
Hey everyone, I'm Dina, and as a Palestinian-American journalist who's reported from the occupied West Bank, put the camera down. Okay. I've witnessed firsthand how Israel routinely targets unarmed Palestinians with force as part of its decades-long illegal military occupation of Palestinian land. I've also seen the militarized U.S. response to peaceful protesters in places like Standing Rock. And in this historic moment of uprisings in the U.S., the parallels between how American and Israeli forces crack down on civilians are more glaring than ever. So why is U.S. law enforcement receiving training from Israel, a flagrant human rights offender? And what does it mean for people on the ground? Now, it's important to keep in mind that the US police and military have historically brutalized communities of color and repressed movements for justice well before the existence of Israel. But now they're building on that by learning from a state that has mastered racial profiling, crowd control, and surveillance. To understand why these trainings are so problematic, you first need some background about how Israel systematically dehumanizes the Palestinian population it completely controls. Israel's creation in 1948 enshrined a nationalist policy of Jewish-Israeli supremacy at the expense of the native Palestinian population, most of whom were forced to flee their homes, becoming permanent refugees. In 1967, Israel began its repressive military occupation of what remained of Palestinian land, subjugating the entire Palestinian population, denying them the rights of citizenship, and crushing any dissent against its policies. Since then, Israeli forces have routinely fired tear gas, skunk water, rubber-coated steel bullets, and even live ammunition at unarmed protesters. So this is a state that violently controls and suppresses the rights of an occupied people. And US police are learning its tactics to use against American citizens. Thousands of law enforcement officials from all corners of the country have traveled to Israel to learn police strategies and exchange tactics. These trips became increasingly common after 9/11 as pro-Israel groups used the so-called War on Terror as an opportunity to push for a closer, unconditional alliance with Israel, which had marketed itself as the world's leading counterterrorism expert.
On these trips, high-ranking US officials are visiting Israeli checkpoints and prisons, places where human rights groups all over the world have documented Israeli discrimination and repression and torture and killing of Palestinians.
I spoke to Stephanie Fox from the Jewish Voice for Peace. Her organization was part of a campaign called Deadly Exchange, which outlines the dangerous consequences of US police trainings in Israel.
Why do you think Israel is so attractive to US law enforcement agencies?
US policing has always been both about enacting a war on Black and brown communities in the US and around the world. So I think that the two being both rooted in racism and state violence, there's a real natural attraction and a desire to trade tactics.
So who runs these exchanges? They're organized by pro-Israel groups like the Anti-Defamation League, which calls itself the world's leading anti-hate organization. The trips are funded privately as well as through grants from the Israeli and US governments, including the Justice Department. The ADL boasts that they've trained more than 15,000 law enforcement professionals and have sent more than 200 high-ranking US officials to Israel. And some officers fresh off these trips have high praise.
This was an outstanding experience, something that I'll remember for the rest of my life.
You've obviously given us a lot to think about, a lot of best practices.
And this is, in fact, the finest training initiative that I've ever been a participant in.
But we've seen the ramifications of these trainings here in the US, with police departments treating American citizens who are exercising their constitutional right to protest as though they're under occupation, especially communities of color. Take Ferguson, Missouri, for example. After the 2014 police killing of Michael Brown, the officers' response to protesters mirrored some of the tactics used by Israeli forces against Palestinians, which civil rights icon Angela Davis has drawn attention to.
The tear gas that was being used in occupied Palestine was the same tear gas that was being used in Ferguson.
And she's right. Officers in Ferguson used the same US-manufactured tear gas and flashbang devices to disperse crowds that Israeli forces regularly use against Palestinians. But that's not all. In 2011, the sheriff of St. Louis County, where Ferguson is located, traveled to Israel on one of the ADL-sponsored police exchange trips. And then, 3 years after the Ferguson uprisings, which catapulted the Black Lives Matter movement to the international stage, the city's police chief also traveled to Israel for training. He said he was blessed to be part of the exchange. And throughout all of this, Palestinians have recognized the shared struggle, even tweeting support and tips to American protesters. But Ferguson is just one example. Other cities and counties where officers have received Israeli training later became the sites of high-profile police killings. That includes Hennepin County, home to Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed by police, and Atlanta, where Rayshard Brooks was fatally shot by an officer. And who could forget the militarized response to protesters in Washington, D.C. after the death of George Floyd? Officers from several agencies, including the U.S. Park Police, fired on protesters with tear gas and flashbangs. And it turns out that many officers from D.C. traveled to Israel for training, including the U.S. Park Police chief and a police commander. And then there's surveillance. Israel's massive surveillance system has inspired U.S. officials, so much so that after a former police chief visited Israel in 2008, his city adopted its techniques.
Our Video Integration Center in downtown Atlanta is modeled after the command and control center I saw in the old city of Jerusalem.
Atlanta has installed over 10,000 surveillance cameras, which have raised serious privacy concerns. But to really get a sense of Israeli inspiration, look no further than New York City. After 9/11, the NYPD and the CIA created a sprawling covert spying operation that surveilled and infiltrated mosques and Muslim neighborhoods in the New York City area. This led to widespread and unprecedented profiling of the region's Muslim communities. A police official told the Associated Press that the program was modeled in part off of how Israelis spy on Palestinians in the West Bank. That program was heavily scrutinized in the US, but widespread surveillance of citizens continues today. During recent protests, US officials surveilled demonstrations in 15 cities using drones and helicopters. They've recorded almost 300 hours of footage, which federal agencies and local police departments across the country can access. But it's not just the US that's learning and implementing new strategies at home. In 2016, Israel copied New York City's highly controversial and racist police policy of stop and frisk. The Israeli version primarily targeted young Palestinian men who were detained and searched without probable cause. All that said, a few communities have stood up to these police exchanges and won. In 2018, Durham, North Carolina became the first US city to ban its police from training in Israel. I spoke to Ajamu Dillahunt, a student and activist with Black Youth Project 100 who campaigned to make this happen.
I saw the interconnectedness between Black and Palestinian struggles. Because the United States and the state of Israel continue to strengthen their relationship, I think oppressed people within both of those places must also strengthen our relationship.
In 2014, the NAACP had called the Durham Police Department a broken system in need of repair due to a troubling pattern of racial profiling and police brutality. And guess what? The department also had a history of training in Israel. The current police chief had previously headed Atlanta's Israel Police Exchange program during her time with that department. So activists wanted to stop her from doing the same thing in Durham. Other communities have also successfully put an end to these trainings, including Northampton, Massachusetts, and the state of Vermont. But Ajamu says even though the win in Durham was exciting, racist policing isn't over.
So while we got a major victory, that we really have to look at the struggle to end the exchanges as part of a broader struggle to build a society where police are no longer necessary. And I hope this current period of rebellion represents a new era of Black and Palestinian solidarity.
Israel's occupation is illegal under international law and is premised on denying basic rights to the millions of Palestinians that Israeli forces control. Is that who we want American police, who are already in need of so much improvement, to be learning from? What do you guys think about US police being trained in Israel? Let me know in the comments, and be sure to check out AJ Plus's continuing coverage of Black Lives Matter protests and the uprisings against police brutality.
I will put the link for that on YouTube in the comments if you guys would want to watch it again, or if you want to share it with anybody. And we are going to move into the Q&A now.
Thanks for showing that. And I hope that you all like that video. It's kind of distressing. We have quite a few questions, and we'd like to get to them all. We're going to synthesize some. We are mindful of the time. Maybe I'll start with asking Eran if he has any comments on the video and what was shown and how that plays into his work, if he would do so.
Sure, thank you. So I'm very grateful for the AJ video that took our research and took the work that we did for over a decade and populated it much better than we could, of course, talk to our partners in Durham and other places. Of Stephanie Fox, who is the executive director of Jewish Voice for Peace, the organization I work with and created this report for Jewish Voice for Peace. I can share with you, you really heard in the video a few of the things that I told you in the lecture. You could hear and maybe visualize better together with the video. I can share with you maybe a few things that are still ongoing. We are working currently with 35 communities across the United States, like the one in Durham or Vermont or New Hampshire that you heard about in the video, There's an incredible coalition in Seattle that is going to pass a resolution, I truly believe, in the next couple of months, and are doing an incredible work to ensure that the Seattle police cannot train not only with Israel, but any foreign military across the world, certainly not one that is abusive of human rights. This seems like a common sense issue for us. Even before we talk about militarization of police, or talk about the harm in the police structure, just talking about the realities of your police training on the other side of the world with a military that occupies millions of people makes no sense for most communities we work with. We also work in Chicago with an incredible coalition there that includes many movements outside of the Palestine solidarity movements. In this moment that we understand that we are all actually working for a very joint cause. So I'm excited about the work, and I really hope that your community will join us and continue this struggle in Minnesota.
Thank you. I wanted to...
It's a little hard to hear you, Diane.
Okay. I wanted to get back to a question that Sylvia asked that I don't see right here right now. I will say Amy had a comment. She said, imagine my surprise when I learned that an IDF trainer was advising the St. Paul Police Force last summer, and he was presented for interviews with the media at the time. So that is happening.
Maybe it's actually worth stopping for just 1 minute and say there's a few serious cases in Minnesota, except for the regular training that we know about and we're talking about right now. We know, and I assume many of you actually know, that in 2012, 100 officers from the Minnesota police received training in Minnesota by the Israeli police in a training that include the Minnesota police, the FBI that was involved, and the Israeli consulate. So diplomats of a foreign country who was facilitating officers from Israel to come to Minnesota and give the trainings. As we said, we want to focus on the cops that are and the law enforcement that are traveling there and what they're witnessing on the ground in Palestinian apartheid state, but not forget that thousands more are being trained every year back at home. The council deputy, Shachal Al-Yeli at the time, said every year we're bringing top-notch professionals to places like Minnesota to train them to think like Israel. And the last thing I would say is that the Hennepin County of Minnesota, of course, sent in the last 20 years, at least as far as we know, the 2 heads of police consecutively. So a long time ago and more recently, in the last decades, it was important for them to send not just any officers, but the head of the department to make sure that they can bring back some of the knowledge acquired there. And of course, the list goes on and on. The Association of Training Officers in Minnesota are including IDF officers that are giving counterterrorism advice and trainings on a regular basis to officers in Minnesota. So just a few targets and a few names to think about as we're doing this work.
Sylvia was asking on the same line. Can you discuss some of the private security firms that might also be taking part in the exchanges?
Absolutely. So the officers in itineraries that we acquired already 5 years ago in 2016 showed that some of the delegations that travel to Israel also are meeting with private CEOs of private weapon companies and technology companies in Israel. One of them you might have known about because they're in the news recently is NSO Group. NSO, which of course developed the Pegasus technology that is enabling dictatorships around the world, including Israel, but also in China and Russia, in certain parts of Asia and Africa, to break into cell phones of citizens, journalists, oppositions in politics, and extort them and know their location. In some of the cases, the use of Pegasus, of NSO group, an Israeli group, led to the killing of oppositions, protesters, journalists in certain countries around us, including Saudi Arabia and India and Brazil. Now, the technology, of course, is not of just a private company that can be anywhere. This private company, NSO Group, is a company that was built from veterans of the A200 unit of the Israeli intelligence, the military intelligence, which can try their products in our little laboratory right there in Palestine. So they're trying the machinery, they're trying the technology, the surveillance technology before leaving the military, building a private corporations with the encouragement and approval of the state of Israel, and help create negotiations and deals between the state of Israel, diplomatics and financial, to other countries in expense for the products that were tried on Palestinians and then moved. We know that in the US, NSO met with the Virginia police, who used their products and pitched to the San Diego police and the Los Angeles police. I met in 2019, very briefly before, in the fall of 2019, before the pandemic strike. I was back home in Palestine and met with one of the delegations that had Southern California officials in it. And I met in Tel Aviv with San Diego police officers that talked to me about their meeting NSO and considering buying the products that were tried here in Palestine to use in San Diego on citizens in California.
You're muted, Diane.
I think I'd like to ask one more question out of the many that we have. And then I would like to finish this or wrap this up with, where are we going from here? Are you, and we do plan to hold a follow-up to this to talk about Minnesota and the Twin Cities and the Deadly Exchange campaign. And I want to leave a little time for that. One last question I will ask that Chuck had was the Deadly Exchange. Right now, you're talking specifically to post 9/11 Israeli training of US police. And would you say that there is any data that police have become more oppressive since 9/11 than they were in the previous, let's say, decades or 100 years prior to 9/11? Or have we seen much more oppressive tactics since that time?
Right. And I think that's a terrific question by Chuck. And I want to clarify and say the institution of police, specifically in the United States, has a long history from the establishment of the country of violent, repressive state violence, being an arm of state violence specifically for communities of colors and for immigrants in this country. I would be very cautious myself to say that after 9/11, the police brutality became any worse, the repression became any worse, or that the training with Israelis specifically made it somehow worse. Because for certain communities in the United States, I'm not sure how it can be worse than 50 or 100 years ago. What I would say is it becoming more sophisticated and it's being refined as time goes on. So if the 1033 program, for example, that started under Democrats, under Clinton in the 90s, a program to move surplus military gear from the military to the hands of local police departments to ensure that weapon companies in the United States are not losing their incentives to continue selling weapon and receive a lot of money and tax breaks for it, even when wars are changing around us, making sure that the weapons are still in use and are still continue to be produced on high level. The 1033 program, for example, existed before 9/11, but after 9/11, it grew exponentially. And from that moment, every department across the country that wanted military gear could have military gear. And we're not just talking about cities like Minnesota or Chicago, Los Angeles or New York. We're talking about tiny towns in the middle of nowhere, USA, that received helicopter choppers, that received machine guns and armored vehicles to their hands. And because they received that, they also need to use it. The Department of Defense incentivized them to use the machinery, to use their no toys in the first 12 months after receiving them. If they are not using it in the first 12 months, it can be taken away from them and moved to other departments that are waiting for them. And this is how we saw a growing of militarized presence, the police disguised as military with a new excuse. Because under the war on terror, you needed more SWAT teams that are combating terror, the big risk that came into our life that was so real that every department could let go of their community projects and work, not that I thought it was worth a lot before, and traded by having a SWAT teams. Because having a SWAT team in a tiny town right now across the United States worth more to the department than trying to work with the community or trying to understand what policing mean in a very specific context. So as I'm not saying US policing is more violent or murderously, it becoming more specific, more sophisticated, and the pool of the suspects, of the targets, is becoming bigger and bigger. And soon, if we won't learn how to stop it and stand next to our partners and friends and comrades and colleagues of color and different identities, and if we cannot stand with communities like in Palestine that are fighting this repression, we'll find out that we are the target and that it was expended enough to come after us.
Great. Thank you. So to wrap up, what would you see as the next step that you see groups taking, other groups you're working with? Is it to investigate what our own police departments are doing, or is there a takeaway that you can leave for us as we plan on what we might want to do next?
Absolutely, absolutely. I first of all, I really appreciate the question, and I appreciate the passion all of those groups co-sponsoring this event have. I am, in many ways, I said it during my presentation, I want to say it again, find myself here building and working on the shoulders of what you did against militarism in your country for many years. I'm coming from a country which militarism is like the air we breathe. It's like the water we drink. We don't really understand the concept of what militarism means because we don't have a society that is not militarized. You know, in Hebrew, we have a sentence that goes, Israel is not a country with a military, it's a military with a country. And in many ways, I felt that. My grandparents were officers in the military before the state of Israel was even existed, that fought the British colonial forces, and then, unfortunately, with Israel, oppressed Palestinians. My father was an officer for many years in Israel, my brother, and me as well, as part of the Israeli military. For me to arrive to the US and start doing this work about the connections between the countries was breathing new air that I didn't know existed. Air of resistance, air of civil society that know how to fight and know how to stand together. So I'm very much appreciative of you, the groups that you represent, and the history that you carry with you. And I truly believe because of you that we have a very bright future to still look up to. The hill is high, the battle has not been won, but I think we are getting much closer than we were 2 years ago or 5 years ago, probably. And with that, I would say there's a general answer and a specific answer. The general answer is that there's incredible movement right now that is working together to end those delegations and end the joint trainings, not only with Israel, but with specifically with Israel, understanding that police and law enforcement, if it's TSA, certainly groups like ICE, border police, cannot go around the world and train with the worst practices and exchange ideas with those regimes, certainly not in an apartheid state like Israel is running in Palestine. And joining this national campaign, joining this national efforts means that you are joining a very powerful movement that is working right now from certain communities all the way to Washington, to congresswomen like in the squad that we work with on conditioning aid to Israel, because we see the delegations as part of the military aid that the US is giving to Israel, the $38 billion in aid, but also as the military budget in large. And we believe that all of stuff are connected. And for the trainings to end, we also should aim to cut the military budget in the US and think together where instead we want to invest that. So that's also a part of what our campaign is doing. In a more local level, I would say that if you decide as a group, as a community, to take on this campaign, we in RAIA, Researching the American-Israeli Alliance, and Jewish Voice for Peace will be very happy to create with you a tailored research about your community, understanding who went, is still going, and is planning to go in the future or go through trainings with the Israeli military, and start building together a campaign that connect nationally, but think locally. And I believe that connecting the dots between this campaign and all the other incredible campaigns that you're already a part of in Minnesota will be a powerful show of force that I can't wait to see.
Thank you. I was reminded while you were talking about all of these different actions that people do. Some of them may seem small. It may seem like the goal is just too big, that we can't do it. But I like to remind myself and remind other people that we don't know what things would look like if we weren't doing this. That we don't know what the connection between US and Israeli police or whatever might be happening if people like us weren't trying to do something about it and weren't trying to inform people of this. They know that people like us exist and that we're working to expose this and to educate people. And I do believe that that's part of the thought process with some of these people that do the things that we don't like, that they know that there are people that don't like them and are going to pay attention and expose it. So it's a big task, but it's encouraging to know that there's all of these different things happening that are trying to kind of tackle the same goal. It's much better than doing nothing about it and just complaining on social media or something like that. So I just want to thank again our guest for joining us tonight, and thank you for everybody for attending. Sorry again if you were trying to watch this live on social media and that didn't work and you had to make your way over here to Zoom, and this will be replaying live, fake live on YouTube and Twitter and Facebook. I think later tonight I'll try to get it up. So if you want to watch this again, or if you wanted to share this with somebody else, look for it probably in the next half hour or 45 minutes. I should get it live. So I'll put a disclaimer there and say that it's not actually live and explain to people what happened, but it'll be there, so you'll be able to find it on our website, or find the link on our website where we had listed the places that this would have been live. And I am going to put these links. It's hard for me to do things and talk at the same time, but I have links to WAMM on social media that I'll put into the chat, as well as a link if you wanted to donate to WAMM. We put on programs like this on all different topics kind of regularly, and I think we often forget to tell people that you can donate to us if you want to. So that's a link that goes to PayPal. So again, thank you to our guest for all of the important work, and you're inspiring us to take more on. I want to invite anybody that's attending that is not part of our committee called End Domestic Militarism, that is part of WAMM, that you can join our committee. We have a Facebook page. It's in those links there. And I think that we can probably schedule a meeting maybe next week or in the next couple of weeks for anybody that wants to discuss this further and figure out maybe how we can start a local campaign. And thank you again to all of our co-hosts who helped spread the word about this and attended it and wanted to be a part of this important topic. If you registered for the Zoom presentation, please look for a follow-up email from us that will have some more information. And if you don't yet, please follow those links and like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter or whatever platforms you might be on. If you're not on those platforms, that's actually a great thing. So just go to our website. And again, please just visit our website and donate to us if you can, if you like this program. Thank you again, and have a good evening, everybody. it was great, and I think that this was wonderful. Bye. If anybody wanted to turn on your camera, or I can turn the chat back on really quick. If you guys wanted to say thank you or say anything to each other, I'll just leave this open for another minute. It's nice when everybody waves to say goodbye. Thank you, everybody. Bye. Have a good night.